Hello, everyone, and welcome to our weekly 30 minutes of Torah study for the Torah portion of Vayeshev. We'll begin with a brief overview of the Parsha. So after the dramatic events of last week's Torah portion, Yaakov settles in Hebron with his family, hoping for some peace and quiet. Now, Yaakov has 12 sons, but he has a special relationship with his son Yosef. He favors Yosef, he gives him a coat, causing incredible jealousy and friction between Yosef and the rest of the brothers. Yosef then has two dreams. He shares them with his brothers. He shares them with his father. These dreams foretell his destiny to rule over them. This does not make him any more popular. In fact, it infuriates and enrages his brothers. The brothers plot to kill Yosef. Shimon and Levi are ready to murder him. Reuven says, wait a minute, let's throw him into a pit. The pit, of course, is filled with snakes and scorpions. Reuven departs. His plan is to ultimately return and save his brother Yosef. Yehuda sees an incredible opportunity to make some money, and they sell Yosef as a slave. The brothers then take this multicolored coat that Yaakov gave to Yosef as a gift. They dip it in blood, and they present it to their father as if Yosef was ripped apart and devoured by a wild animal. The Torah then changes the topic. Now, this topic is detailed. There's so much to say. It warrants not just one class, but many classes, but I'll try to explain it briefly here in the overview. Yehuda has three sons. His oldest marries a woman named Tamar. He commits a sin and he dies. According to the principles of Levirate marriage, the second son marries Tamar, he commits a sin and dies as well. According to the principle of Levirate marriage, the third son is meant to marry Tamar. However, he's too young. Yehuda is a bit nervous and says, Tamar, maybe go back to your family and we'll revisit this in the future. Time goes by, and Tamar is not given the opportunity to marry Yehuda's youngest son. So she devises a plan where she is going to solicit Yehuda, because technically, according to Jewish law at that time, Tamar would have been able to marry Yehuda in a Levirate marriage. So Yehuda unknowingly solicits his daughter-in-law Tamar. He is not aware that it is his daughter-in-law. She becomes pregnant, and even though she is bound to marry Yehuda's youngest son, so therefore she is accused of harlotry and she's sentenced to death. Now, when Yehuda solicited Tamar, he did not have any money, so he gave with her various things that she could identify with him in the future. So she says, oh yes, you think I committed harlotry? To the person that these items belong, that's the person who I committed these acts with. Yehuda sees them, recognizes that he's the one, he admits to being the father, and saves the life of Tamar, and twin boys are born, Zerach and Peretz. And the Torah tells us that Peretz is in fact the ancestor of King David, who of course is the ancestor of Mashiach. This of course tells you that there's so much more to the story than meets the eye, but again, it's not the topic for tonight's class. So Yosef is sold as a slave to Potiphar, and he's clearly very talented. God blesses him in everything that he does. So his master Potiphar makes him the overseer of all of his properties. Potiphar's wife attempts to seduce Yosef, and it is a struggle for Yosef, but ultimately he rejects her. She, of course, feels scorned. She claims that Yosef attempted to rape her, and Yosef is sent to prison. But Yosef in prison is clearly a successful person that God has blessed, and the jailers actually put him in charge of the prison as well. So now let's go to the beginning of this week's Torah portion, which is a continuation of last week's Torah portion. At the end of last week's Torah portion, the Torah tells us about Esav, his wife, and his children, and the very many descendants and kings which would emerge from him. And now in this week's Torah portion, the Torah starts telling us about the family of Yaakov and the events and the stories that took place in his life. Now Rashi makes a very important comment. Why do we have the story of Esav and his descendants followed by a much more detailed story of Yaakov and his descendants? So Rashi says, Scripture describes Esav's settlements and his generations, but only briefly, because they were not distinguished or important enough to elaborate on in detail how they settled and the order of their wars, or how they drove out the Horites. In contrast, Scripture elaborates on the settlements of Yaakov and his generations and all the events that caused these travels, since they were considered important enough to God to dwell upon at length. Similarly, you find regarding the 10 generations from Adam to Noach, so-and-so begot so-and-so, but when Scripture reached Noach, it dwelt upon him at length. This is analogous to a pearl that falls into the sand. A person searches in the sand and sifts it with a sieve until he finds the pearl. And when he finds it, he casts the pebbles from his hand and keeps the pearl. So Rashi explains that the reason why the Torah tells us briefly about the children of Esav and at great length about the children of Yaakov is because the Torah needs to provide some type of historical context to the events that take place in the life of Yaakov. Briefly about Esav, because Esav is not the main event, it's just there for context, and then at great length about Yaakov. And Rashi says we have precedent for this idea. From Adam to Noach is about 1,000 years, yet very little is shared about that time period. The Torah just tells us, so-and-so begot so-and-so, so-and-so begot so-and-so, because we need to have some historical context for the events that took place. When it gets to Noach, then the Torah goes at great length. The problem with this explanation of Rashi is that it only makes sense from Adam to Noach. In order to have some historical context for the story of Noach, we need to know who preceded him. If we wanted to have some historical context for the story of Yaakov, we may need to know about Esav and his immediate family. However, the Torah doesn't just tell us about Esav's immediate family or the past leading up to the current story with Yaakov. The Torah tells us about 8 kings that will emerge from Esav in the future. I'm talking about hundreds and hundreds of years later. Look at Rashi's comment. He says, and these are the kings. There were 8 kings, and Yaakov raised an equal number in whose days the kingdom of Esav temporarily ceased to exist, namely Shaul, Ishbosheth, David, Shlomo, Rechavam, Asa, Avia, and Yehoshaphat. So the Torah doesn't tell us the past about Esav in order to understand the current historical context of the story of Yaakov and his family. Rather, the Torah tells us what's going to take place amongst the descendants of Esav 500, 600, 700, 800 years into the future. Why talk about Esav's future descendants? Rashi says it's to provide context. But what historical context could the discussion of the descendants of Esav that will not emerge for hundreds and hundreds of years, how does that shed any light on the events that are taking place in this week's Parsha in the life of Yaakov and his children? The answer must be that the Torah tells us about Esav's future descendants because it's relevant to that moment of Yaakov's life, and it's also relevant to Yaakov's descendants for 500, 600, 700, 800 years, and even beyond that, it's incredibly relevant for us today. And this idea is actually embedded in a story in the Parsha. Yaakov has a confrontation with Esav. Thankfully, they make peace. And Esav says to his brother Yaakov, you're traveling, I'm traveling, let's travel together. Let's travel like brothers, let's travel like family. Let's go on this journey together. But Yaakov understands this is not a good idea. And he says to his brother Esav, I have little children, right? I have all of these sheep, babies. They're not going to make it. We're not going to be able to keep up with you. It's too hard. It is too fast for us. It's going to slow you down. You continue going on your pace. I'm going to go at my pace, right? And eventually we're going to meet up. Let my Lord go on ahead of his servant while I travel slowly at the pace of the cattle before me and at the pace of the children until I come to my Lord in Seir. So Yaakov says, I'll go at my pace, you go at your pace. One day we will meet up. One day we will be reunited. When will that be? When I arrive in Seir. Now the commentaries point out that Yaakov never made it to Seir. Was he lying? No, he was not lying. Yaakov was going to come to Seir. His destiny ultimately was to arrive in Seir. When is Yaakov going to arrive in Seir? With the coming of Mashiach. So it's the Yaakov's descendants who are actually continuing on this journey, almost parallel to, almost together with Esav. When will that reunion take place? That reunion will culminate when the journey of Yaakov and Esav culminate, which is going to be with the coming of Mashiach. Now, this interpretation of the story, that the story doesn't just represent Yaakov and Esav at that time, but the story of this week's Parsha is actually hinting and alluding to the journey of Yaakov and the journey of Esav, which is going to take place for centuries, and not just centuries, but for millennia in the future unto this day, right? It actually makes a lot of sense that Esav's descendants are included, because Esav's descendants are just as critical to the story as Yaakov's descendants. In order to explain this, we got to get into a little bit of Kabbalah. Now, it's a deep idea. I'm going to try to be as clear as I can, but also as brief as I can. If anyone would like some further clarification, feel free to email me, text me, call me after the class, and I'll be very happy to follow up. Yaakov and Esav were not just brothers. They were not just two people who lived 3,000 years ago and had descendants amongst whom which the Jewish people are descendants of Yaakov. Rather, Yaakov and Esav, they represent two very powerful, two very potent, two very real, different forms of spiritual energy. The Kabbalah says that before God created the world which we presently and currently live in, God created another world. Our world was preceded by another world, but that world failed. That world would not function. The world collapsed. All right. So there are two stages in creation. The first world is called the world of Tohu, the world of chaos. The way the Kabbalists describe this world is that this was a world of unlimited energy, the most powerful divine light. However, there were not sufficient vessels to contain, to harness that light. And the vessels broke. The vessels shattered. The world completely fell apart. It was the world of chaos. However, the vessels of that world, which contained within them the most incredible, the most powerful spiritual energy, those vessels fell and actually became the substance, the material, the building blocks of the world that we live in today, which is called the world of Tikkun, the world of order, a world where the light and the vessels are perfectly matched, and there's complete harmony between these forces. However, buried in the physical world are the shattered vessels of the world of Tohu. They're concealed, they're hidden. We cannot see the incredible and intense power that they contain, but that is in fact the building blocks of the world that we live in today. I want to give you perhaps a psychological analogy for us to be able to understand the idea of the world of Tohu, the world of Tikkun, and how and why they're relevant to us today. Imagine a scenario where a child witnesses or experiences a traumatic event that is so powerful, it is simply too much for the young brain to be able to handle. If the child would be able to fully experience that memory and relive it, it would be a life of chaos, it would be unproductive, it would be a destroyed person. So therefore, what does the brain do? The brain shuts down that memory, right? It buries it, it conceals it, it hides it. In order to secure that this child will not live a life of chaos and unproductivity, it hides it, it buries it to allow the child to live in a normal and orderly way. However, the memory is not erased. It does not disappear. It's not gone forever. The pieces of that memory are embedded in the subconscious of that child. So when the child grows, subconsciously, that memory is still having an effect and an impact on the personality and on the character development of this young child. You may have no idea. You're not even aware, but it's affecting you and it's having a huge impact on your life. Through therapy, you might be able to dig down, you might be able to uncover that memory, and then you will be able, as a healthy adult, be able to extract from that memory, right, the powerful energies that are embedded in it, unleashing them and allowing you to direct them in the most healthy, the most productive, the most useful possible way. So this is Tohu, this is the world of Tikkun. Tohu, the most intense, powerful energy embedded within creation. Our job is to uncover and to extract that energy. How do we do so? Through Torah and mitzvahs. Kabbalah continues to say that Esav is a physical manifestation of the world of Tohu, which means Esav and his descendants are the physical manifestation of the world of Tohu. The world of Tohu became the building blocks for the physical world that we live in today. Therefore, when we engage with the physical and the material, we are essentially engaging with the hidden and concealed energy of the world of Esav. And of course, we, the descendants of Yaakov, represent the spiritual energy of the world of Tikkun. We are charged with bringing order to the chaotic and unbridled energy of the world of Esav. The reason that the Torah gives us a list, not just of the past descendants or the current descendants of Esav in the life of Yaakov, is because the story that's taking place in this week's Torah portion is not only about Yaakov and Esav way back then, 3,000 years ago. Rather, the story is about the journey of every Jew today as we march forward in history. And it's the descendants of Esav which are critical to the journey and the mission and the purpose of the Jewish people, because it's the descendants of Esav which represent the physical world with which we must engage through living spiritually, meaningfully, through Torah and mitzvahs, and extracting that spark. In the words of the Rebbe, the purpose of Yaakov's settlement is not just about him and his family inhabiting the land of Israel. Rather, it is, as Jacob said to Esav, until I reach my Lord in Seir, namely the coming of Mashiach. Exposing the inherent godliness in the material is our mission. Yaakov engaging with Esav, the spiritual engaging with the material, uncovering the most powerful, holy, spiritual, godly energies that are buried and that exist within the physical and the material, thereby creating a world that is a home for God, and that will usher in the Messianic era. So the culmination of the journey of Yaakov and the descendants of Esav will be creating a world that's a home for God and the Messianic era. In other words, the discussion is not just about Yaakov taking up residence. Rather, it's about the purpose for which Yaakov must reach there, Seir. And as much as Yaakov can only get there by interacting and engaging with Esav and his family, it turns out that Yaakov's true story is hidden within Esav's. However, we encounter another problem with this explanation, because this explanation says that the destiny of the Jewish people is to wrestle, so to speak, with Esav, with the goal being to uplift, with the goal being to transform the physical and the material to be something godly and spiritual, to make the world a fitting place, to be a dwelling place for God, and to bring Mashiach. There's an inherent danger, though, in this type of activity. How do we ensure that we don't get affected by Esav? We are charged by God to live a spiritual life. If a person wants to live a spiritual life, you want to have the least amount of distractions. Move to the mountains, eat little, drink little, sleep little, stay away from the physical and material, and you'll be able to live the most spiritual life. However, the Torah says, no, that's not what the Torah wants from us. We are meant to wrestle, to grapple with Esav. George Bernard Shaw said, I learned long ago never to wrestle with a pig. You get dirty, and besides, the pig likes it. How is it possible that a Jew can wrestle with Esav, can immerse and invest your time, your energy, your valuable resources with the physical and material world without the physical material world affecting and impacting you? How do you make sure that you are the one to impact and to affect the physical and material world, the world of Esav? To answer this question, we have to go back to that original Rashi and the parable, the metaphor that Rashi used. Rashi says a person searches in the sand and sifts it with a sieve until he finds the pearl. And when he finds it, he casts the pebbles from his hands and keeps the pearl. Now, at first glance, Rashi is simply telling us that sometimes in life, you have to go through the dirt in order to get to the good stuff. However, if that was Rashi's intention, he could have been a lot more brief. The fact that he develops this entire parable tells us there's a lot more to his words. What Rashi is telling us is that the process with which we have to interact with the physical and material world, with which we have to interact with Esav, is much like the process of filtering out the sand and the pebbles to get to the pearl. We have to appreciate what is the good, save it and preserve it. We have to recognize what's dangerous, what's harmful, what's negative. We have to make sure to throw out the bad. In the physical world, right, the world of Esav, the world of Tohu, we have food. We wear clothing, right? There's sports. There are so many elements of the physical and material world that we engage in. However, we have to do the effort, we have to make the time to have the appropriate filter. We have to filter out what of the physical and material is good and healthy and positive, and what is dangerous and unproductive and has to be discarded, because at the end of the day, we do have to grapple, we do have to engage with the physical and the material. I'll give you an example of this attitude. Imagine a person is an alcoholic. They've been going to AA, right? They're attending meetings and they're sober for 10 years. But alcohol exists in the world. And at some point in time, you're going to encounter it, you're going to engage it, but you have to know when. When can you be involved and when can it be discarded? You cannot go to your friend's birthday party in a bar. Unhealthy, unproductive, that can't be part of your life. But you certainly should be able to go to your friend's bar mitzvah. Even though there's going to be wine, even though there's going to be alcohol, right? You are able to attend the bar mitzvah, but you should not be able to attend a bar, right? The same thing, Rashi says, we have to apply to the rest of our life. The sand in life is one thing, the pebbles are quite another. The metaphor speaks of two items, sand and pebbles. Because in our quest to conquer Esav, there are two methods of conquest and sublimation represented by sand and pebbles. Sand covers over items. As in our metaphor, it covers the pearls. However, it is not an inherently negative thing as it has constructive uses. By contrast, pebbles don't just obstruct things, they're downright harmful with little productive use, so they must be discarded. This is instructive for our task in exile in the context of our job to redeem divine sparks. Sand and pebbles indicate two methods. Pearls are a metaphor for those divine sparks that have fallen into the sand and pebbles of this material world. So it's a very powerful message that comes out from the Torah detailing the descendants of Esav and this beautiful parable that Rashi has about filtering and sifting through the pebbles and the sand in order to get to the pearls. And that is, Judaism does not demand that we be ascetic, It does not demand that we live in isolation. Exactly the opposite. Judaism demands that we specifically engage with the physical and the material in this world, but we have to do it with brains, right? We have to do it in a smart fashion. We have to do it with the appropriate filter. We have to take an honest and genuine look at our life and say, what elements of the physical and material world that I am engaging in can I uplift and transform and bring spirituality into it? Which elements am I able to affect? And which elements are those that are affecting me? The ones that we're able to transform and uplift, those are the ones that we keep. Those are the ones that become part of our life. We're making the world a better place. But the elements of our life, of our engagement to the physical and material that are impacting us, that are dragging us down, just like the pebbles, we need to discard as well. Sand is a metaphor for material things that only obstruct the divine spark. A Jew can redeem these sparks by engaging with that in a matter, with that matter in a holy way. Pebbles are metaphors for utterly evil things from whose clutches the holy sparks cannot be extracted with conventional methods. Instead, these items must be discarded. So some genuine introspection is required in order to make sure that we're living life the way that God has intended. So the answer to question number 2, how do you avoid getting carried away with the physical and material? By being discerning, deciding what can be utilized positively and what must be eradicated. Please join us again next week. The topic of the class is going to be about Hanukkah. However, next week's class is going to be pre-recorded. A link is going to be sent out where you can watch it on YouTube, because there's our mega Hanukkah event taking place on Tuesday next week. The following week, Tuesday, December 7th, the class is also going to be pre-recorded and a link is going to be sent out. It will not take place live on Zoom because I have to be at a bar mitzvah. I hope everyone can join us on Tuesday, November 30th at the Yard at Bayshore, 5 p.m. There's going to be an incredible gelt drop, a live DJ, LED dancers, a photo booth, crafts, giant menorah lighting, Hanukkah giveaways, warm drinks and donuts, hot food for sale, catered by Mizrahi Grill, and craft beer on tap. So it should be a great time. But the next 2 classes are going to be pre-recorded on YouTube and a link will be sent out. Thank you so much for joining and have a wonderful day.